sehr gut, wieder in Deutschland zu sein. Und ich versuche, Deutsch zu reden. Aber mein Vortrag ist auf Englisch, aber ich versuche es zu reden und zu verstehen. Well, my lecture doesn't have a name, but it does have a motto. That's what you see on my screen. Everything that happens is at once natural and inconceivable. That's also, I think, one of the things that motivated Tolstoy in writing his novel War and Peace. Many years ago I wrote a book about Tolstoy's novel War and Peace, and in fact ever since that book was published I have more or less believed that I had taken leave of Tolstoy. I not only stopped writing about him, I also stopped reading his books, and I even discontinued my habit of collecting the books, the articles and the snippets of information about him that I could lay my hands on. That isn't to say that I wasn't grateful for all the doors Tolstoy had opened for me. Many times, I think, quite against his own will. I definitely was grateful, very grateful, for what Tolstoy had learned me. War and Peace had been, as Voltaire says, point de vue lumineux from which I had been able to orient myself in philosophy of history. For me, Tolstoy's great book had been what it has been for many people ever since the book was published in the 1860s, an initiation into the phenomenon of history. History both as a process and as an intellectual occupation. But I was convinced that I had said pretty much all I wanted to say about Tolstoy's ideas about history, that I had exhausted him, that I could move on to other subjects, other projects, other preoccupations. So with one exception, I have never occupied myself with Tolstoy again. Though of course he occasionally popped up when I needed some contrary insight about the way historians go about. The exception was that some years ago the Dutch equivalent of the historisches tijdschrift asked a couple of historians to write an article about how they were influenced, molded or just educated by what they considered to be their teachers. And I chose Tolstoy. Tolstoy rather than one of the professors that had in fact in the flesh tried to discipline me, because I realized that Tolstoy had been in a way my guru. Not in any spiritual sense, but in the sense that he, much more than my professors at the university, had taught me the one thing I had hoped to learn at the university. Why, in the first place, I so much wanted to study history. And the conclusion of my article was rather sad. After having lived through my passion for Tolstoy, I was ready to profit from what historians at the university had to offer. But by then it was, of course, too late. But apart from that lone article, Tolstoy had ceased to be a presence for me. For years I took it for granted that I had left him behind me, that I had come a long way since my book about how history figures in War and Peace. But then last week I reread what I wrote back then. I was shocked. I hadn't made any progress at all. In all those years, in all those articles and lectures, I had done little else but inching around in the universe War and Peace had opened up for me many, many years ago. Every time I took on a new project, I had done so under the impression that I embarked upon something new, something that was, of course, rooted in what I had done earlier, but definitely not already completely included in it. But it was. All the themes I had explored the last couple of years were already there. History as a kind of dissonance reduction, the notion of trauma, the status of historical decisions, the problem of agency, the concept of dissociation, yes, even the way history may be regarded as a branch of evolutionary science. It was all there already. So I am, I guess, as Isaiah Berlin would have said, a hedgehog rather than a fox. Whereas the fox knows many things, I, as a hedgehog, know only one, be it a rather big one. What struck me most, however, was that all the themes, all these themes I found in the book, were somehow reflections or emanations of what is clearly Tolstoy's main theme in War and Peace. And because this central theme hasn't been discussed, rather to my surprise, very extensively in the existing literature about the book, I will make it the topic of my talk today. This central theme is Tolstoy's sensitivity for the historicist state of mind of his contemporaries and his vehement criticism of the contamination of life with this historicist state of mind. In fact, my main thesis is that Tolstoy's book can be regarded as a multi-leveled attack on what he saw as one of the more disastrous results of the French Revolution and the historiographical attempt to come to terms with the revolutionary trauma, the contamination of historical reality, more specifically the way history is made, with historiographical, more specifically historicist conventions. Tolstoy was, I think, at least as perceptive a critic of historicism as Friedrich Nietzsche was, and his attack antedates from Nützen und Nachteil der Historie für das Leben by some 15 years. Well, I will say some things about this historicist state of mind, historicist from Historismus, of course. The German term is, I think, much better, but I will use the English one, historicism. I will say some things about this historismus later on. But for now it's important to note that one of the uniquely interesting things about Tolstoy's book is that it does something that is logically impossible. It offers a kind of common ground between historical reality and historical representations, between res gestae and historia rerum gestarum. As a novel, War and Peace investigates and validates the experiences of the author. It explores, as Immanuel Kant would say, the noumenal insight of historical reality. As a history, the book is an attempt to give a truthful account of certain historical episodes, Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the Battle of Borodino, the fire of Moscow, etc. And in that sense, the book is a representation of the phenomenal outside of a chain of events. But the most intriguing feature of War and Peace is, however, that Tolstoy also demonstrates how reality and representation interact. His book may be regarded as a kind of arena in which he could show how experience and literary codification processes influence each other. And this arena-like quality is not a coincidence or a critical invention. Tolstoy's letters and journals intimate that he was very conscious of the historiographical conventions of his time, and that he had a formidable urge to express his views about history, historiography, and the philosophy of history. Now, of course, War and Peace is a superbly entertaining story. A story that can be summarized like this, on one page in fact. But we shouldn't forget that Tolstoy, one of the great moralists of literature, very much wanted to sell a vision. And this vision cannot be summarized very easily. In a conversation with Alexander Goldenweiser, Tolstoy said that the most important thing of a work of art is that it has a focus, a place in which all the rays converge and from which they all emanate. This focus, he adds, should not be expressible in words. In fact, Tolstoy said the most important feature of a good work of art is that its content can only be expressed by itself. So again, the content, the focus of War and Peace has to do with the interaction between reality and codification processes. This interaction may take many forms, but one of the things Tolstoy shows his reader is how in the course of his book the three male heroes, Nikolai Rostov, Andrei Bolkonsky and Pierre Bezukhov, free themselves of the historiographical conventions which impair their capacity to experience reality as it really is. Interestingly, the main female heroine, Natasha Rostova, is a natural in this respect. She doesn't have to reclaim the ability to experience reality as it really is, from what she has absorbed from books, newspapers and gossip. Becoming infected with historical conventions is apparently, according to Tolstoy, a male liability, unless, of course, you happen to be as uneducated as the muzhik Platon Karatayev. In as far as Rostov, Bolkonsky and Bezukhov do indeed gradually learn how to experience reality, how it really is, War and Peace may be regarded as a kind of Bildungsroman. Now, most Bildungsromanen, of course, address preconceptions about love. War and Peace, however, belongs to a special subcategory of the genre, a category of which there exists, as far as I know, only one specimen, that of the anti-historicist Bildungsroman. In my talk today I will show that War and Peace is indeed an anti-historicist Bildungsroman, that Tolstoy takes issue with the way his contemporaries allowed historical reality, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the way that reality is represented, to influence each other. The fact that War and Peace is the sole example of a singular genre doesn't mean that it addresses a minor issue. On the contrary, ever since the beginning of the 19th century, the historicist state of mind the book takes on so passionately was so pervasive that it can only be compared to the pervasiveness of Christianity in the Middle Ages. And in that sense, War and Peace is to the 19th century as the Enlightenment is to the Middle Ages. In my discussion of War and Peace as an anti-historicist Bildungsroman, I will try to protect myself from being blinded by Tolstoy's explicitness. Tolstoy chose to devote page after page, even whole chapters of the book, to his theories about history. But these rather shrill theoretical passages, revealing as they may be, do not, I think, contain his most interesting views. On the contrary, a less explicit, but in my opinion much more thoroughgoing critique of the historiographical convention of his time lies hidden in the way he himself represented in his novel Past Reality. Consequently, I will zoom in not on the views Tolstoy professed to have, but on the views he actually embodied in his novel. In order to understand Tolstoy's project, we first should take a closer look at 19th century historicism. Now, 19th century historicism almost always has been studied in isolation, as a specific, powerful, creative, fruitful, though ultimately, of course, also quite problematic way to conceive of history. Now, I use the word isolation because most authors, how broad-minded they happen to be, tend to zero in exclusively on the representational side of history. Now, as you all know, the word history has two meanings. It refers both to the past as such and to the way we take stock of the past, both to the events themselves and to what I just called the representational side of history. And I think the Latin expressions res geste and historia verum gestarum indicate much better what is at stake here than words like past as such and representation outside of history. Res gestae, after all, has to do with human actions. It refers to the actual making of what we afterwards recognize as our history. And consequently, res gestae is not solely something of the past, but something of the present as well. Res gestae may even be said to refer to reality, to the raw, unrepresented presence of the here and now, as well as the there and there. And Historia Rerum Gestarum, for its part, is much more than just our account of the things we ostensibly did. Historia Rerum Gestarum refers to the way we assimilate, liquidate, digest, commemorate, celebrate, or just remember our res gestae. So in the most general sense, Historia Rerum Gestarum refers to how res gestae are taken up in our culture, be it in marble, paint, words, notes, or just vague notions, or as it is called, common knowledge about things, about how things came to pass. Most studies of historicism restrict themselves to the sphere of Historia Rerum Gestarum. They deal with the way human actions have been taken stock of. Friedrich Meinecke, for example, identifies the two key features of historicism as the principle of individuality and the principle of development. And the principle of individuality, it's indicated by Ranke's saying, jede Epoche ist unmittelbar zu Gott, and the principle of development, as it surfaces in Ranke's Mythen in der Verwirrungen des Tages, des sich doch im großen Gang der Dinge wahrnehmen. But no matter how sensible, elegant and valid Meinecke's analysis is, by locking himself up in the sphere of Historia Rerum Gestarum, he doesn't quite catch the elusive energy and the magical effectiveness of 19th century historicism. Perhaps the first historian to bring the sphere of res gestae into play as well was Reinhard Koselleck. In his brilliant essay Vergangene Zukunft, Koselleck has argued that the last quarter of the 18th century witnessed a fundamental reorientation towards time. That in that crucial period, historical time was invented. To quote Koselleck, die Zeit bleibt nicht nur die Form, in der sich alle Geschichten abspielen, sie gewinnt selber eine geschichtliche Qualität. Nicht mehr in der Zeit, sondern durch die Zeit vollzieht sich dann die Geschichte. Die Zeit wird dynamisiert zu einer Kraft der Geschichte selber. Now, by claiming that in the latter part of the 18th century, time became a historical force, Koselleck in effect states that in that particular period, the two meanings of the word history began to interact in a new way. That, to put it a little less abstract, the relation between the way history was made and the way history was written changed. As Koselleck famously put it, Geschichte was swallowed up by history. Or to put it in the concept I just mentioned, res gestae was swallowed up by Historia Rerum Gestarum. I think Koselleck is really up to something. I also think that swallowing is not in this connection a very happy metaphor. Well, what exactly does that mean? Historie, swallowing up Geschichte. Historia Rerum Gestarum, swallowing up res gestae. Time becoming a historical force. To what phenomena in the real world does the metaphor refer? An additional problem is, I think, that Koselleck conflates two separate, though mutually reinforcing developments. The first is that in the second half of the 18th century, the spheres of Historia Rerum Gestarum and res gestae began to come into their own. and started to drift apart. Whereas until way into the 18th century, people were confident that there was, as we said, a constant correspondence between the camp and the council table. At the end of the century, this correspondence wasn't taken for granted anymore. And the second development is that in the beginning of the 19th century, these two embryonic spheres became locked in a kind of symbiosis. A symbiosis that made them grow coexistentially and made them both prosper like they never prospered before or after, until at the beginning of the 20th century, the symbiosis fell apart. I think the first development need not concern us here, but the second is very relevant for what Tolstoy considered to be his project in War and Peace. The emergence of what I've called the symbiosis of Historia Leben, Gestaan and Res Gestae was a mediated consequence of the French Revolution. It was, to be more precise, a consequence of how Restoration Europe happened to come to terms with the traumatic discontinuity of the revolution. This traumatic discontinuity could best be assimilated by taking it up in an ongoing story, by having it absorbed in a plot, by relegating it to an overarching mythos, as the ancient Jews would call it. And that was exactly what the early 19th century historians did. Historians like Guizot, Michelet and Ranke wrote histories that presuppose the revolution. They reinterpret history from the perspective that such a monstrous event as the revolution could in fact happen. And this in fact was what Ranke meant by stating that the mission of the historian was die letzte und nächste Vergangenheit mit der früheren in Einklang zu bringen. What Ranke really meant was to bring the most recent history, that is the French Revolution, in harmony with what preceded that most recent history, the revolution. But in order to be maximally convincing, this plot, this mythos, had to be found rather than fabricated by the author. A fabricated plot was just a contingent invention of an exchangeable citizen. A found plot, however, had the authority of reality itself. And it is one of the problems of realism, how to suggest that what the author had to offer was not just the fruit of his imagination, but an unmediated presentation of what he had honorably found, heard, seen, or been given. And the amazing fact is that the great early 19th century historians, Ranke, Thierry, Michelet, really believed that the plots they came forward with were given to them, that they owed them to a kind of grace, that they were just passing on to the public what was somehow mysteriously disclosed to them. Thierry, a real pioneer, seems to have been the first historian ever who proudly declared what you can still hear historians say, that the facts speak for themselves. And Fustel de Coulanges, somewhat later, said that what spoke through his mouth was not he himself, but history. And Ranke, of course, wanted nur zeigen, wie es eigentlich gewesen ist. But surely the most spectacular example is Jules Michelet, who not only saw the plot of history, but actually embodied it. As he said, je suis la France. Michelet believed that he was a completely transparent medium through which the plot of history made itself known to the book-buying public. The notion that history had a plot that was not an artifact of what historians did, but an ingredient of reality itself, was an extraordinarily potent remedy to come to terms with the French Revolution. It was, as it turned out, also a remedy that came to affect the body it wanted to cure. It may even be that the remedy to come to terms with the revolution changed Europe at least as much, and arguably even more than the revolution itself. The way the remedy affected the body had to do with the fact that believing that history has a plot necessarily feeds back into the present. If you believe that history has a plot, you will sooner or later ask yourself how you have to behave in the here and now in order to further the plot in the direction of the future. And the question then becomes how to act out the plot of history. How to do precisely those things that later turn out to be historically right. And if this is what Koselleck meant with his remark that Geschichte is swallowed by Historie, I absolutely agree. The scorching ambition to coincide with history, to catch the right wave, to find one's Toulon, is the obsession of the 19th century. From Guizot, the Decembrists, Thorbecke and the 48er right up to Lenin and Trotsky. The feeling that it was one's duty to advance the plot of history gave the 19th century its unique energy. Even conservatives felt obliged to move forward. There really was only one thing that was surely and definitely not in accordance with the plot of history: doing nothing. And this then is what the 19th century symbiosis between res gestae and historia rerum gestarum, between history as it was being made and history as it was written, looked like. Citizens of all persuasions felt obliged to act out the plot of history. And historians, for their part, read the plot of history out of what the citizen actually did. For as Michelet said, the plot of history manifests itself in what turns out to be happening, in the spontaneous acts of the people. Vox populi, vox Dei. The symbiosis between res gestae and historia rerum gestarum, between history as it was being made and history as it was written, can be easily summarized. In this way, history became the language of politics, and politics became the language of history. Now, War and Peace is Tolstoy's energetic attempt to expose, explore, dissect, ridicule, and ultimately to vilify and condemn this symbiosis between res gestae and historia rerum gestarum. The book had a long prehistory. In the mid-50s, after the end of the Crimean War and the accession of the supposedly liberal Tsar Alexander, Tolstoy was troubled by two questions: what his responsibility vis-à-vis society was, a question which with introduction in Russia of the idea of popular sovereignty was becoming more than merely academic, and the other question was what might be called the question of timeliness. Can time be ripe for change? And what's the status of such ripeness? And even then, years before he wrote War and Peace, Tolstoy already was angered by everybody who pretended to know the signs of the times. He felt that it was utterly wrong to let the two questions cancel each other out, as if your life had been worthwhile when you simply did what later turned out to be historically right. And one of his main culprits was the editor of the Contemporary, Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who, according to Tolstoy, radiated to believe that it was possible to fathom one's time, and that one might act upon it. Tolstoy had nothing but scorn for those contemporaries like Chernyshevsky who trusted that the mythos of history was revealed to them, who believed that they had, as Flaubert put it, discovered the sun. At first, Tolstoy tried to incorporate his views and opinions in a novel about the Decembrists, the Decabrists. The conspirators who had in the 1820s tried to make Russia a constitutional monarchy, but had failed miserably. This was a very polemical choice, because the Decembrists had also believed that the time was on their side, that the future would fall in their lap if they just gave it a chance. But who had, But the novel about the Decembrists never came off, and Tolstoy switched to the Napoleonic era. And in War and Peace, he takes issue with the way 19th century historians dramatize history. They dramatize history in as far as they create the illusion that they give their public an unimpeded view of the past, that they don't mediate between the past and their readers, but they just show what is on view. This dramatization of history is a necessary complement of the belief that history has a plot. Now, in War and Peace, Tolstoy de-dramatizes history. It's quite ironic when you come to think of it that the academic, unliterary historians of his day dramatized the past, whereas he, as a novelist, de-dramatizes it. Whereas 19th century historians would attempt to create the illusion that the public has direct access to the past, Tolstoy draws attention to the way the historian, as a teller of story, mediates between past and public. Tolstoy thus shows, stresses mediation, whereas Ranke advises Rückkehr zu den ursprünglichen Mitteilen. Tolstoy informs his readers that Andrei reads a letter in which the diplomat Wilhelm reports about what an aging general has written to the Tsar. So it's a kind of fourfold mediation. The historicist historian always gives the impression that his reader is looking, as it were, over the back of the Tsar, that he reads what the Tsar is reading. The historicist historian suggests that he is on the spot, that he sees how history comes about, that there is no fork of history, that he didn't have to struggle with, as Clausewitz would have said, friction. The historicist historian is what Sainte-Beuve said about Thiers. He comments hundreds of thousands of facts like an able general comments hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And in my book on Tolstoy, I compared the historicist historian with what the military historian John Keegan said about Wellington in the Battle of Waterloo. He always managed to be present where the fighting was hottest. And the pretension of the historicist historian that he always managed to be present where the fighting was hottest is exposed quite clearly in the Tilsit episode in War and Peace. In that episode, Tolstoy exposes the historian, embodied in Boris Drubetskoy, as a voyeur who can only see what he vehemently wants to see. Whereas the naive observer Nikolai Rostov, who was drawn to Tilsit not because he likes to be present at the historical event, but because he wants to do his jailed friend Denisov a favor, sees the central truth. Drubetskoy takes very much care to be present where the fighting is hottest, in that is moments that are going to find their way into future history books. He managed to be present when the emperors, for example, are on a raft in the Yemen, signing the peace of Tilsit. And this is what Tolstoy writes. At the moment the emperors went into the pavilion, Drubetskoy looked at his watch. He did not forget to look at it again when Alexander came out. The interview had lasted 1 hour and 53 minutes, an item which he recorded that evening among other facts which he felt to be historical importance. So you might say that in the Tilsit episode, Tolstoy doesn't show how it really was, but what showing how it really was really entails. He shows that showing how it really was is almost always completely prefigured by our conceptions about how history looks like. And that consequently only those aspects of reality are shown that lend themselves to being shown. That, for example, the meeting of Napoleon and Tsar Alexander on the raft in the Yemen lasted 1 hour and 53 minutes. Now, characters which the reader does not identify with, like Boris Trubetskoy and Berg, do not possess the ability to make contact with what there really is to see. They only see what they think they should see. They conform to the way historians codify the world. With real history, with that is traumatic events, that too much familiarity with historiographical conventions seriously hampers the ability to experience reality as it really is. And quite a good example is Nikolai Rostov. Rostov described the Schöngraben affair, described the Schöngraben affair exactly as men who have taken part in battles always do describe them. It is as they would like them to have been, as they have heard them described by others, and it sounds well, but not in the least as they really have been. Rostov was a truthful young man and would never have told a deliberate lie. He began his story with the intention of telling everything exactly as it happened, but imperceptibly, unconsciously, and inevitably it passed into falsehood. And Tolstoy makes it abundantly clear that it is in fact very difficult to disentangle yourselves from the preconceptions that prefigure what you think you've seen. If Rostov had told the truth, his listeners simply wouldn't have believed him. Rostov's listeners, Tolstoy says, expected to hear how forgetful of himself and all on fire with excitement, he had rushed down like a hurricane on the enemy square, hacked his way in, slashing the French right and left, how his saber tasted flesh, and how he had fallen exhausted, and so on. And that was what he told them. But Rostov eventually learns how not to give in to the expectations of the public. He learns how to keep his mouth shut about the unspeakable horrors he has seen and witnessed, the horrors that constitute, according to Tolstoy, the essence of history. And whereas Nikolai, in his telling about the Battle of Schöngraben, does at least sense that there is a veritable abyss between truth and story, Trubetskoy, the embodiment of the historicist historian, is satisfied with his own words. He is satisfied because for him the words he speaks completely coincide with the reality he talks about. With Tolstoy, truth, which for him is nothing but experience, is by definition inexpressible. And the wonder of Tolstoy is that he nevertheless manages to convey experiences. And I think you may say he succeeds precisely because he doesn't pretend to be present where the fighting is hottest. Vintage Tolstoy, for example, is the passage where Andrei remembers how Natasha had told him about how she had gone to search for mushrooms and how every minute she broke off to say, "No, I can't, I'm not telling it properly. No, you won't understand." Although Prince Andrei tried to reassure and persuade her that he did understand and he really had understood all she had wanted to express. But Natasha had been dissatisfied with her own words. She felt that they did not give an idea of the passionately poetic feelings she had known that day and which she wanted to convey. The anti-historicist program of the novel is, of course, most explicitly embodied in the figure of Pierre Bezukhov. In the first chapter of the book, Pierre Bezukhov defends Napoleon's crimes by arguing that Napoleon, being the embodiment of history, was justified in or even obliged to committing these crimes. In the Borodino episode, however, Pierre himself is so thoroughly at odds with history that he is completely disoriented by what he sees. In that episode, Pierre is in fact the absolute antithesis of Trubetskoy at Tilsit. All that Pierre saw to right and left of him was so negative that no part of the scene before his eyes answered his expectations. Nowhere was there a field of battle such as his imagination depicted. There were only fields, clearings, troops, woods, the smoke of campfires, villages, mountains, streams. And try as he might, he could describe no military position in this landscape teeming with life. He could not even distinguish our troops from the enemies. The Borodino episode is in fact the epitome of Tolstoy's argument with the historicist brand of history, with, to be more precise, the symbiosis between res geste and historia rerum gestarum. Historians would describe Borodina from a privileged vantage point and would give the impression that they managed to be present where the fighting was hottest. Tolstoy, however, robs Pierre of all knowledge about history, battles, and the significance of the event he happens to witness. Pierre, he says, Pierre had no suspicion that this little space from which view cannon and firing was the most important point of the battle. He fancied indeed, simply because he happened to be there, that it was one of the least significant places in the field. And the irony, of course, is that Pierre is present where the fighting is hottest, but is completely unaware of it. And for me, Tolstoy's remark that Pierre didn't know any better than that Rayevsky Redoute was the least significant place of the battle simply because he happened to be there, is the programmatic center of the whole book. It encapsulates the anti-historicist mission that War and Peace seeks to accomplish. Tolstoy's conviction that it is very wrong, not just morally, but existentially, but ultimately also historically, to try to coincide with the plot of history, also shows in how he depicts the epic battle between Napoleon and Russia as a whole. Ultimately, he says, it doesn't pay to try to act out the plot of history. It's only, he says, it's only subconscious activity that bears fruit, and a man who plays a part in a historic event never understands its import. As soon as he tries to realize its significance, his actions become sterile. This sterility is in the novel embodied not just by Trubetskoy and many other Soviet politicians and common readers of books, magazines and newspapers, but of course also by Napoleon. Trying to bring your will to bear on history, to realize what you believe to be its plot, will eventually fail. Tolstoy in effect states that Russia defeated Napoleon because it had little talent for living out a plot. And it's a logical conclusion from this view of history. Tolstoy fervently believes that history should be made, if at all, in the manner Kutuzov commands the Russian army, by not standing in the way of anything expedient and by not permitting what might be injurious. Kutuzov, Prince Andrei says, will not introduce anything of his own. He will not scheme or start anything. He knows that there's something stronger and more important than his own will, the inevitable march of events. And with inevitable march of events, Tolstoy does not mean the plot, the mythos of history, but the state of affairs that comes about when everybody just stays within the bounds of what he has to do. When everybody, as Bob Dylan says, just gets on with getting on. Tolstoy's Kutuzov is not really devoid of will. His genius is that he lacks the ambition to force himself onto the world. He lacks the ambition to act out a plot. In this, he is the antithesis of Chernyshevsky. Chernyshevsky had posed the question, what is to be done? On the presupposition that something could, had to be done. And the answer Tolstoy gives by means of his Kutuzov is nothing. And the irony is, of course, that later historians construed Kutuzov's command as a coherent strategy. As Tolstoy remarks, in giving battle at Borodino, Kutuzov and Napoleon acted contrary to their intentions and good sense. But later on, to fit accomplished facts, historians provided cunningly devised proofs of the foresight and genius of the generals, who of all the blind instruments of history have been most enslaved and involuntary. Thank you very much.